You don't like to talk then?
Well, not really. Sometimes if there's something to say, but there's really nothing to say these days.
There's a version of Beatles history that most people know by heart. John Lennon was the rebel. Paul McCartney was the charmer. Ringo Starr was the lovable everyman. And George Harrison? George was the quiet one, the spiritual seeker who sat in the back and let the others do the talking. But history has a way of smoothing over its roughest edges. Behind the carefully curated image of the serene, sitar-playing mystic was a man who felt real pain, real anger, and real resentment. And the deeper you dig into George Harrison's life, his own words, his memoir, interviews from the people closest to him, the more clearly you see it. There was one person in his world who wounded him more deeply than anyone else ever could. Not a rival, not a stranger, someone he admired, trusted, and ultimately grew to resent with a bitterness that lasted decades. This is the story of that relationship, and it might just change the way you see the Fab for forever. To understand the depth of George Harrison's resentment, you have to go back to where it all started, not on a grand stage, but on a school bus in Liverpool. George was 14 years old when he first befriended Paul McCartney, and it was Paul who brought him into John Lennon's orbit. In the beginning, George was the youngest, the tag-along, the kid who had to prove himself just to be in the room. When he auditioned for the Quarrymen in 1958, John Lennon initially dismissed him, too young, too green. It was only after George impressed him by playing a guitar part note for note on a moving bus that Lennon reluctantly let him in. That moment set a template that would define George's entire career with the Beatles, perpetually having to prove his worth to a man who already had his mind made up. John Lennon was 4 years older than George. In adolescence, that gap feels enormous. Lennon had an established identity, sharp, literary, commanding. George looked up to him. He has described Lennon as one of the most charismatic and brilliant people he ever encountered. But admiration, when it goes unreciprocated, has a way of curdling over time. By the time the Beatles became the most famous band on Earth, a rigid hierarchy had formed inside the group. Lennon and McCartney were the songwriters. They were the brand. Their partnership, celebrated in music history as one of the greatest creative collaborations ever, also functioned as a closed door to anyone outside it. George Harrison was extraordinarily prolific as a songwriter. He carried notebooks filled with ideas, melodies, and lyrics. But on Beatles albums, he was typically allotted 2 songs, sometimes 3. Lennon and McCartney split the rest. The message was unspoken but unmistakable. Your songs matter less than ours. What made this particularly painful for George was that he knew, on some level, that his songs were extraordinary. Something, which he wrote in 1969, was called by Frank Sinatra the greatest love song of the past 50 years. John Lennon himself said it was the best track on Abbey Road. George wrote Here Comes the Sun, a song that has accumulated hundreds of millions of streams in the modern era and remains one of the most beloved pieces of music ever recorded. He wrote While My Guitar Gently Weeps, which is routinely listed among the greatest rock songs in history. And yet, for the majority of the Beatles' active years, George was treated as a junior partner. His compositions were rehearsed with less enthusiasm, recorded with less care, and released with less priority. He internalized this deeply. It wasn't simply professional frustration. It was a message about his worth as a human being and an artist. Paul McCartney has received much of the public scrutiny over the years for his sometimes domineering behavior in the studio. George himself once said in a 1974 interview that McCartney could be overpowering, that he would sometimes prefer other musicians. But with Paul, there was always something warm underneath the friction, a brotherly bond, however complicated, that both men acknowledged until George's dying day. With John Lennon, the dynamic was fundamentally different, and it was darker. Lennon had an extraordinary gift for cruelty. It was part of his genius. That razor-sharp wit could illuminate truth in an instant, but it could also draw blood. And toward George, Lennon wielded that wit like a weapon. When George became increasingly devoted to Indian music and Eastern spirituality in the mid-1960s, Lennon mocked it. Not always openly, not always cruelly, but persistently, dismissively. He treated George's spiritual journey as a phase, an affectation, something to be gently ridiculed at the dinner table rather than engaged with seriously. This was devastating to George Harrison, because his spirituality was not peripheral to who he was. It was the center of him. His introduction to the sitar and to Ravi Shankar, his embrace of Hinduism and the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita, his devotion to the Hare Krishna movement. These were not celebrity hobbies. They were the architecture of his inner life. To have John Lennon, someone he had admired since adolescence, someone whose approval he had been chasing since he was 14 years old, treat all of that as a joke was a wound that never fully closed. George Harrison was not a man who easily expressed his grievances. His default mode was philosophical acceptance, a quality shaped by his spiritual beliefs. He preferred proverbs to confrontations. He was more likely to express pain through a song than through a shouting match. But the evidence of his feelings about Lennon is woven into the record he left behind, and it speaks volumes precisely in what is absent. In 1980, George published his autobiography, I Me Mine. It is a deeply personal document, full of reflections on his music, his spirituality, and his memories. What many readers noticed immediately was the near-total absence of John Lennon. For a man who spent a decade of his life in one of the closest creative partnerships in musical history, George had almost nothing to say about the person who shaped so much of that decade. This was not an accident. George Harrison was a careful and thoughtful writer. He chose what to include and what to leave out. The silence around Lennon was not oversight, it was statement. John Lennon, characteristically, was furious. In a 1980 Playboy interview, just months before his death, Lennon attacked the book openly, calling it a betrayal and questioning why George had so little to say about their shared history. The anger in Lennon's response only confirmed what George's silence had already communicated. They both knew the omission was intentional. The clearest public record of how deeply damaged their relationship had become arrived in January 1969, captured on film during the recording sessions that would eventually be released as Let It Be. Lennon and McCartney were both frustrating George during this period, but it was the overall atmosphere, an atmosphere Lennon helped create and sustain, that finally pushed George to his breaking point. On January 10, 1969, George Harrison walked out of the Beatles. He quit the band. He left Twickenham Studios and didn't come back for nearly 2 weeks. When he returned, it was only after the others agreed to his terms, move the sessions out of film studio, abandon the idea of a live concert comeback, and give him more space. George later described the period as one of the lowest of his life inside the band. He felt invisible. He felt managed. He felt that his contributions were being treated as inconvenient. And while Paul McCartney's bossy perfectionism played a role in that friction, it was the broader culture of the group, one that Lennon had helped establish and enforce, that made George feel like a guest in his own band. When the Beatles broke up in 1970, something surprising happened to George Harrison. He flourished, completely and immediately. His debut solo triple album, All Things Must Pass, released in late 1970, was a commercial and critical triumph. It was as if years of pent-up creativity had finally been set free, pouring out of him with unstoppable force. The album was also, implicitly, rebuke. Here was a man who had been rationed to 2 songs per Beatles record, now releasing 30 tracks worth of material, and it was brilliant. Critics and fans understood immediately that the Beatles had been sitting on a songwriter of the first rank. George had known it all along. The world was only now catching up. In 1971, he organized a concert for Bangladesh, one of the first major humanitarian benefit concerts in rock music history. It was George Harrison, the quiet one, the dismissed one, who took rock music and used it as a tool for international conscience. Lennon wasn't there. McCartney wasn't there. George was. When John Lennon was murdered outside his New York City apartment on December 8, 1980, the world went into shock. George Harrison was devastated. He wrote a song in tribute, All Those Years Ago, which featured both Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr. It was a generous, heartfelt public tribute. But grief, for George, was never simple where Lennon was concerned. He grieved John as he might grieve a difficult older brother, someone who had shaped you, hurt you, and left before you ever fully resolved things between you. There was love there. There was also unfinished pain. George was not the kind of man to dance on a grave or celebrate someone suffering, but neither was he willing to pretend that everything had been wonderful. In interviews after Lennon's death, he was honest about Lennon's flaws, his selfishness, his tendency to dominate, his sometimes brutal emotional distance. George mourned who Lennon was, not a sentimental fantasy of who he wished he had been. That honesty is perhaps the most revealing thing about the depth of George's feelings. He respected Lennon enough to tell the truth about him, even in death. That is not something you do for someone who didn't matter. That is something you do for someone who mattered enormously, someone who hurt you precisely because they mattered so much. In the final years of his life, as he battled cancer with extraordinary grace and quiet courage, George Harrison reflected on his relationships and his past. He had found peace, genuine, hard-won peace, through his spirituality, through his family, through his music, and through time. But he never pretended that the road had been easy. He never rewrote history to make the Beatles a story of uncomplicated brotherhood. He understood that great art is often born from great tension, and that the tension inside the Beatles, the hierarchy, the dismissals, the creative battles, was inseparable from the music that came out of it. John Lennon remains one of the most important figures in 20th century music. His intelligence, his courage, his artistry are beyond dispute. But to George Harrison, he was also the man who spent years treating him as lesser, who mocked his spiritual life, dismissed his songs, and never fully recognized what was sitting right beside him. George Harrison passed away on November 29, 2001, at the age of 58. He left behind a body of work that continues to grow in stature with every passing year. He left behind a son, Donnie, who carries his spirit into the present. And he left behind an honest record of his life, one that refused to flatten its complexities into something easier to consume. The quiet Beatle turned out to be the one with the most to say, and the man he never quite forgave, the one who had dismissed him the longest and hurt him the deepest, was the brilliant, cruel, irreplaceable John Lennon. Behind the peace signs and the gentle smile, George Harrison carried a wound. He carried it with dignity. He carried it with wisdom. But he carried it all the same. What are your thoughts on the complex relationship between George Harrison and John Lennon? Share them in the comments below. If you found this story compelling, please like, subscribe, and explore more of our deep dive histories.